Alright, so in this episode we are going to make some small modifications to the conversation manager. The reason we're going to do that is we need to prepare it to use exactly what this choice system needs to send its way. So in our dialog file, we've made it where we can run logical lines detected by keywords. Our input line was detected with the keyword input followed by some sort of title, and then it would wait for that to complete, and then we would have our input. So we're going to be doing the same thing with the choice title. So we'll actually have a little keyword that'll tell us that this is going to be a choice line followed by some sort of question that we're going to be asking. Now, the way that this choice is going to work, it's going to present several different items that you can use. And with those items, those choices that you can make, they will also have their own lines that can be run depending on if you selected that choice or not. So we need to have some paired data, and that means multiple lines are going to compose this one single logical line. So the best way that I could think of to make this all look neat and organized and get our data the way we need it is to encapsulate everything within some brackets. So these will be the symbols that identify all of the data contained for the choice. And when we have a choice, we can just go ahead and indent because lines are going to be trimmed anyway. And we can start a line with some sort of symbol, like a minus, that tells us this is a choice. So we'll have a choice 1 and maybe a choice 2, and we can have as many as we want. But the important part is then we're going to have some lines in these things. And we can have lines and commands that will be run for depending on if we make these choices. So our conversation manager is going to need to halt when it finds this choice, which we could do with the input panel, but then it needs to run these lines. And right now we have our conversation manager running a single conversation, which consists of the whole file. So we need to divide this up into separate conversations that can be run within some sort of queuing system. That way, when we cause a question to show up on screen and we receive our answer, then we can prioritize this new sub-conversation inside of the manager, and it will run and finish all of this, and then continue where it left off. So let's say that we have our conversation manager here. The dialog system will call for a main conversation to start, at which point that main conversation will become the active conversation for the conversation manager. It will be at the top of the queue. But once we start some sort of other conversation, what will happen is we'll get a conversation added to the stack, and then it will wait for the main conversation to complete, and once that completes, it will automatically move into conversation 2. That's how we'll be able to stack conversations, but that handles it in a linear path where one must complete before the other begins. If we do a priority conversation instead, then that conversation will head to the top of the stack, and the main conversation will be interrupted. It will pause until this new one completes, and then the main conversation will continue where it left off. We'll do this with a conversation queuing system. So this system is going to be added on to our conversation manager as it is, and we'll make slight modifications to it, but we need two scripts for it. Our first one is going to be just the conversation type. So the conversation is going to it's going to hold the data, basically like a data container for our dialog system for the dialog lines. This is basically the same thing for the conversation manager. It will hold the lines, the progress, and anything else that we need in order to progress the conversation forward. But the conversation manager will still handle the logic. It will just use that as a data entry. The next thing that we need is the conversation queue. And the conversation queue is going to contain different conversations and have the conversation manager execute them in the particular order that they are within the queue. So since this is just a data type, I'm moving it into the dialog namespace, and I'm removing monobehavior and the existing functions. And we're just going to make ourselves a constructor for this class type. Since this is our new conversation type, we're going to have the same data that we've been using already. We're going to have the list of lines as well as the progress of this conversation. And when we create a new one, we want to define what's going to populate it. So the list of string for our lines and the integer for our progress. Once we initialize it, then this .lines will just equal the lines that have been passed in, and the same for our progress. And now we need to make some fields where we can access the data that we'll need for this conversation. Now I'm going to do that through a couple functions down here. So we're just going to have a public int for get progress, and this is going to return our progress. And we'll have the same thing for public void set progress. And all this is going to do is say that progress equals the value that is passed in, which I need an integer for the value. Next, to make it easier on ourselves, let's make a way where we can just increment it. So public void increment progress, and then we'll just say progress plus plus there. We may also want to know how many lines there are in this conversation. So we can say public int count, and I'm going to leave it just as a getter here, not as like a function type, because that's the same as in our lists. So lines.count. And speaking of the lines, what are our lines? Let's say public list string called getLines is going to equal our lines. And then maybe we'll also want the current line, which would be the line at the current progress. So public string will get the current line, and that will be lines at the progress that we are at right now. And in order to know if this conversation is finished, let's make one last function, which is a public boolean return for has reached end. And this is going to tell us if we reach the end of the conversation, which, as you might guess, is just checking if our progress is greater than or equal to the lines.count minus 1. And that is our conversation class. Not much to it. Like I said, just a bunch of data. We actually don't even need Unity Engine here, and we don't need the system collections namespace. But we do need generic because we're using the list type. Now let's look at the queue. Again, I've removed the base functions as well as the monobehavior instance and added it to my dialogues namespace. And we're going to need a queue for this. A queue is something that we can easily add or remove objects to, and they don't change the order. All they do is just queue and dequeue, which means they come in and they go out. So that's a good way of processing things in order, which is perfect for our conversation manager. That's exactly what we need here. This is not something that needs to be public, so we're going to make it private. Skip my P there. There we go. And it's going to be of the queue type. So we are going to want a conversation. Look, it already knows what I'm trying to do. And that's just going to equal a new queue for our conversations. Now, in order to know what the active conversation is, we want to get the one that is at the very top of this array, or this queue. So we will make this public because our conversation manager is going to reference this to know what the current conversation is. So we'll have the conversation type, and we're going to call this top. It's going to be the very top one in the queue. This is the one with the priority that needs to finish right now. And so that's just going to be our queue, or conversation queue dot peak. Peak is just going to look and see what the first item is. Now, as for adding items to that queue, we're going to make a function called enqueue that can be accessed from our conversation manager, so we can add new conversations when it receives commands for such. So we'll have a public void called enqueue, and we're going to take a new conversation. And what we're going to do here is just say conversation queue.enqueue. We're pointing that straight to our queue, so that way it can add a new item. But this is not going to be anything of priority. This is just going to be adding one to the back of the queue, so it'll still continue to execute the one that is currently running, and then once it finishes that conversation, then it will move on to the next one. That might not be something we use so frequently because we'll be switching conversations via commands, but one thing that we need for our choice system is going to be a priority enqueue, which means we need to add it to the top of the queue. So we'll make this public void, and we call this enqueue priority. And again, we're going to take a conversation, and that's really all we need to take in. Now, what we need to do, since we can't change the order of something in a queue, we're going to go ahead and just generate a new queue. And we're going to have this thing at the very top of it. So let's make ourselves a new queue for the conversation, and that's going to be a temporary queue. We'll make a new queue of the conversation type. And the very first thing that we're going to do is enqueue the conversation that has been passed in. So now this one is the first item in the queue. So we need to add the ones that were in the previous queue. And we'll do that by dequeuing the items from our original conversation queue right into this new one. So that way they come in and it's basically this conversation that we've added is now at the top of the list, but the other ones maintain their order. So let's go through each one. So while our queue.count is greater than 0, we're going to say that queue.enqueue, we're going to enqueue a new item, which is our conversation queue.dequeue. And when we dequeue, it's automatically removing it from the queue, which is why we're using a while loop. So once that's done, then our conversation queue is going to equal the new queue. And we now have that conversation added to the very top. It's now the priority. So how about dequeuing, making that available to our conversation manager? Let's make a public void called dequeue to remove the topmost element once we've finished with it. So let's first check if conversation queue.count is greater than 0, then conversation queue.dequeue. So we can add them, we can add a priority, and we can dequeue. Now let's just check if this is empty, because our conversation manager is going to need to know how many times it can go and grab a conversation from this queue. It needs to know if it's empty or not. So let's make a public boolean called, let me scroll down here, called isEmpty. And all this is going to do is it's going to return us if our conversation queue.count equals 0. If it's 0, then we know we have no items and we are empty. So there's our conversation queue. Now let's go to our conversation manager. Now it's time to tie the conversation queue into the management system and run these things in the order that we're supposed to execute them. So let's first add ourselves a conversation queue. That way we can keep track of things. So let's go ahead and make this private conversation queue, and we'll make that a conversation queue. And once we go and construct this thing, let's go ahead and assign a new one. So conversation queue will equal a new conversation queue. Let's go ahead and add ourselves the ability to add items and remove them as well. So public void enqueue, we'll say conversation, and this is going to point to our conversation queue, and we're going to enqueue it. We'll do the same thing for the priority enqueue. Enqueue priority, conversation, and this is going to be our conversation queue.enqueue priority. Visual Studio almost got that right. There we go. Okay, nice. So we've got that integrated. Now we just need to change a couple things down below. So you know that our start conversation is taking in a list of strings. We want to change that to now we're taking in a conversation. So we're taking in a straight up conversation. And when we do that, we want to make sure that we enqueue this to our queue. So let's go ahead and say enqueue that conversation, and we are ready to roll. So that means when we're running this thing, we don't actually need a reference to the lines because it's going to grab it straight from the queue. So we'll remove that from running conversation. Of course, that'll give us an error first. But that's just because we need to come down here and remove that reference because we don't need to take in a conversation. We're going to pull it straight from the queue. Because as we're running this, it's going to continually loop. So if we change the queue or if it needs to move on to the next item, as it loops, it's going to continually look for the top item in the queue. So if it changes, it's going to automatically adjust with it and start executing the lines of the new top item. Which means we need to change this loop from being a for loop because we don't know that we're necessarily going to be working with the same conversation. We might introduce a new one, and that one takes precedence. So let's change this to a while loop, and we'll say while not conversation queue dot is empty. While we have items in our conversation queue, we know that we can execute something. So what can we execute? Let's say that conversation equals our conversation queue dot top. So we're going to get the top priority conversation, and this is what we're going to be working with. But I'm actually going to take this and make it a variable up top. So I will just go ahead and copy that and remove the reference there, because our dialogue system is also going to at some point need reference to what conversation is running on this manager. So we'll want that publicly accessible to it. So as we have our conversation queue here, let's also make a public conversation called conversation. Guess I didn't need to copy that after all. And we'll just have a public getter and a private setter. By default, it will be empty. So when we do this, we're going to cache this new value as the top conversation. And now these lines are looking at the actual raw line that would be present in the previous conversation. But we no longer have that as a list of lines. What we instead have is we can go ahead and grab the current line, which is what this would be looking for, and then just examine that. So we'll go ahead and store this. We'll make a string for the raw line, and that's going to equal our conversation dot current line. And we can just swap out the reference here for our raw line. Did I not give it E there? I did not. And the same thing here when we parse it. We're going to parse the raw line and get the data that we need from there. So that goes ahead and gets all the data we need. Then as we execute the logic, the dialogue, the commands, even logical lines, everything else is fine, except when we come down to the bottom. Now, after we come outside of this loop here, where we're examining if we are looking at a logical line or a regular line, after that, we know what we're working with. We know that we've reached the end of this line, so it's time to advance. So we'll only advance if we haven't already reached the end of this conversation. Otherwise, we're going to dequeue it and move on to the next one if we have one. So let's check if not conversation dot has reached end. If we have not reached the end, then conversation dot increment progress, and we're going to move it forward and continue in the loop. Otherwise, we're going to say conversation queue dot dequeue, and we're going to remove this one because we're done with it. But this would give us an issue. As we're no longer using a for loop and incrementing automatically, if we detect that this is a null or just empty line, then we need to go ahead and make sure that we also increment in this place and then continue. So our conversation dot increment progress needs to go here, otherwise we'll have ourselves stuck in an infinite loop. And that's looking pretty good. The only thing I may add here, which it looks like I had an oversight earlier. We have a while loop. While the conversation queue is not empty, once it is empty, we have completely ended this, and we should set the process to equal null. That process being the actual process that's running this conversation loop. That's what's started when we start the conversation, and that's what's monitored for whether this conversation manager is running or not. So let's make sure that at the end we go ahead and set that to null. Now, if we hop back into Unity, we'll get an error here saying that the dialog system has an issue now that we've changed that list string format into a conversation type. So let's go to that line inside of our dialog manager, which is going to be, for some reason, it does not take me to the line anymore. It's kind of weird, but here we are. So conversation, or the dialog system, is only using these two say methods, which don't do anything to convert it to a conversation. So let's just add one more, public coroutine for say, which instead of a list of strings, now we'll take a conversation called conversation. And then we're going to return our conversation manager dot start conversation, and we're going to start that conversation. So if we get a new list of lines, we'll say that conversation, we'll change that to lines. We'll say conversation equals new conversation built from those lines. Now I'm getting an error here because I also need to specify a starting index, which I don't want to have to do that every time. So let's go back there and just make sure that int progress defaults to 0 in our conversation type. That way, it's completely optional and we don't have to pass in a starting value. Also in our dialog system, we have our conversation manager stored right here, but nothing has access to it. Rather than make commands to enqueue new conversations through our dialog system, let's just make it where we can access the conversation manager directly and use the functions defined in there. So we'll turn this to public, and then we'll go ahead and make that publicly retrievable, but only privately assignable, so it can't be deleted or changed by anything. And then we can go ahead and freely enqueue new conversations. Okay, so before we go any further, let's make a small change here, as I did notice a little issue when I tested this, and that is really when you go to run a dialog file that ends with empty white space, it can get stuck there. That's not something I had taken into consideration. I'm assuming that the dialog file ends on a legitimate line, not on white space, but we need to take that into account, so that way we don't run into errors in the future. First of all, I've gone ahead and made conversation a getter, which as long as the conversation queue is not empty, we'll go ahead and grab whatever's at the top of the queue. Otherwise, we return null. And then in the running conversation coroutine, I just cache that as the current conversation. That way we're not continually grabbing it from the queue and trying to peek every time. Okay, so here's the issue. If we're looking at if it's null or white space, all we're doing is trying to increment the progress and continuing. We're not actually dequeuing this from the conversation if we've reached the end of it. So we need to make sure that we haven't reached the end right here. So we're going to need to run the same logic that we're doing right here. And rather than repeating that, let's go ahead and extract that into a new function. So we'll make this a private void called try advance current we'll just say try advanced conversation. And we're going to pass in the conversation that we're working with. Okay, so what we're going to do is right off the bat, we're going to go ahead and say that conversation.increment progress. Let's go ahead and advance it forward. And now let's look. If conversation.has reached the end, then we want to make sure that we dequeue it from the queue. And all we want to do is just replace this here at the end of the line with try advance conversation and pass in the conversation that we're running. And the same thing up here. Instead of just incrementing the progress, we'll increment and we'll also check to see if the line has ended. Oh, whoops, I'm supposed to use current conversation, not conversation. So let's make sure that we pass in the current conversation, which is the cached conversation that we pulled a second ago. If we try to use conversation, what conversation is doing is it's looking at the conversation queue.top, which is calling peek from the queue, and that might actually mess with our progress. So we just want to go ahead and reference the cached value. And in our conversation, since we're checking the progress after we increment it, let's just go ahead and remove the -1. So we're looking for if our progress after it's been incremented is now outside of the range, being at lines.count. Now, inside of Unity, let's go ahead and test this out. Let's make a new test conversation queue script. And inside of that, all I'm doing is building a list of lines, and then telling the dialog system to say that, at which point it will convert it into a conversation, enqueue it into the system, and once it's finished, we'll hide the dialog system. This is doing absolutely nothing different than what we've been doing, other than incorporating the queuing system, so we can make sure that everything is still working. So here we start, we get the first line, so the conversation was built and it's running. We have line 2, and we have line 3. And it finishes, and everything exits out. So that's good. So like I said, all that means is we have not broken anything. Everything is still working just as it was before. But now here comes the test of using the queuing system. So inside of update, I'm going to go ahead and just, if I press the Q key, I'll generate a new set of lines, and then I'll enqueue that. And this will be tacked on to the stack of conversations, and this will execute after the current conversations that's running. But if I hit the W key, then I'm going to make an important conversation and enqueue that as the priority, which should interrupt the main conversation, but not stop it. It'll just interrupt it, and then we'll continue this, and then we'll move on to finish the original conversation and anything that came after it. Again, that is done through the enqueue and enqueue priority commands. So if we go ahead and attach that to our testing script and make sure that's the only one active, and let's go ahead in Unity and try to play this. Okay, so we get our first conversation running. So I'm going to go ahead and tack on queue. We'll try the just adding a conversation. So we have line 2, line 3, and it should move on to conversation 2, which it does. Here we are. This is the start of an enqueued conversation, and we can keep things going. If, on the other hand, I choose to interrupt this by pressing the W key, let's move to line 2, and now I'm pressing W. Oh, but I have an error. I have an error in the console saying invalid operation, the queue is empty, coming from conversation queue line 20. This is happening when we're enqueuing a priority and we're dequeuing the current conversation into the new queue. This line is actually fine. What's not fine is the line right above it, where I'm saying while queue.count is greater than 0, that should be the queue that we're dequeuing, not the one that we are enqueuing. So while the conversation queue, which is our original, while we still have items left in there to enqueue to the new one, we're going to enqueue it and remove it from the old conversation queue. And now we go back to Unity, this should work. So we've got line 1, we got line 2, and let me go ahead and hit W. Okay, no error, but this should take us to the priority. No, remember, it should have taken us to this is line 3 if we were running it in order, but it's not. Now we're going to this new conversation that's taken priority. And we go there, International Dog Day, and now we continue the original conversation. If I hit Q, then we can go to the enqueued one. Perfect. So now we have implemented a queuing system to our conversation manager, and this is how the choice system is going to integrate nicely into our existing dialogue system. So next video, we're going to be actually doing that integration through the dialog file, and we'll be making use of this enqueuing system to prioritize the new conversation, which is a result of the choice that we make. So I'll see you guys there.